Hello and welcome to our psychology class. Today, we are honored to have Deb Gajic as our guest speaker. Deb has given several insightful talks on various aspects of research methods in psychology, and today, she will be discussing the topic of self-reports. Our host for this session is Dot Blakemore, who will be guiding the discussion and asking questions.
Oh, okay. So what is self-report?
Self-report is exactly what it says on the tin. It's asking participants questions. So we can do this via a questionnaire or an interview or get our participants to keep a journal, for example. It's simply getting the participants to report on themselves.
What's the difference between a questionnaire and an interview?
So a questionnaire is a written set of questions that the participants read and then they answer, usually on the questionnaire itself or tick a box. Whereas an interview is verbal. There's an interviewer there actually asking the participants the questions face to face.
What's the main limitation of self-report?
Well, the main limitation of self-report, of course, is that participants don't necessarily tell you the truth. However, don't say participants lie. Instead, say self-reports lack validity. It's all about using our terminology. And what we mean by that is they might show social desirability bias, where they give answers that they think make them look better or look good. Friend of mine, for example, is a practice nurse, and she said that she knows she's wasting her breath when she asks people how many units of alcohol do you drink in the average week, because they're not going to tell her the truth. Social desirability, they're probably going to say less because they don't want to sound like an alcoholic.
Right. Okay.
The other issue, of course, is demand characteristics, where they say what the researcher wants them to say. They're trying to guess the aim. And the final problem is it's actually really, really difficult to write good questions. Usually, you know what you mean, you know what you're getting at, but someone else, when they read your question or you ask them your question, might not. We know in everyday life, we ask people questions and they go, I don't know what you mean. What do you mean by that? And it's actually really hard to write very clear, easy to answer questions.
Are there any strengths? What are the main strengths of a self-report?
Main strength is that it's really replicable. Once you've devised your questions and they're good questions, you can ask them to lots and lots of participants, especially questionnaires, because you can just give them out to loads of people. Although, of course, one of the issues with questionnaires is that the return rate's often really low. We all know we get these questionnaires that are emailed to us and most of us just ignore them. So that is a problem. But there is the ability to give it out to lots of people. They're also very ethical because participants have a choice. They don't have to answer your questions. They're anonymous. So it's very ethical. They can withdraw at any time. And of course, that idea of them being replicable also makes them very efficient, especially questionnaires. You can gather a lot of information really quickly. Interviews are less efficient, but questionnaires are a really efficient use of time.
Right. Okay. So tell me more about questionnaires.
Questionnaires tend to have more closed questions than interviews. So they gather quantitative data. So, for example, you might say, have you passed your driving test? Yes or no. There might be like at scales, like how much do you agree or disagree with this statement? And they tend to have things like strongly disagree, disagree neither, strongly agree, and agree. They're always an odd number on a Likert scale. So they're 3, 5, and 7, so that there's a neutral value in the middle. Sometimes we use psychometric scales, which are very similar, but usually on a scale of 1 to 10. So how much do you like blah? 1, not at all. 10, very much. We can have open questions on questionnaires, though. So they would get some qualitative data. So we might say, tell me about your hobbies. tell me about your experiences learning to drive, so that we get some qualitative data as well.
So what's the most difficult thing for researchers when designing a questionnaire?
Writing suitable questions. It's really hard. I think lots of students think that they can do it because they've been doing it for years in secondary school in all of their different subjects, but actually it's really hard. So one of the first things we need to look at is, does our questionnaire have internal validity? So are all our questions related to the aim? It's very common for people to think they've got to include a question on gender or age on their questionnaire. Well, actually you don't unless it's relevant. So it's making sure all our questions are relevant and are gathering data about what we're interested in. We've also got to be very careful. There are some common pitfalls to avoid. So not using jargon, because obviously people won't understand that. So if I said, for example, do you know anyone who is protanopic? You might go, what the hell does protanopic mean? That actually just means colourblind. But obviously a much better question would be, do you know anyone that's colourblind? People could answer that. We also have to be very careful to avoid leading questions in emotive language. So if I said, do you approve of the oppressive uniform policy of this school? That's obviously using emotive language. And that also then becomes a leading question because I'm saying my opinion of it in the question. Example of a leading question, we know this from Loftus and Palmer, don't we, not to use leading questions. So now that you know how bad vaping is for you, will you give up? Obviously, that would be a leading question. We also need to avoid double-barreled questions. So, for example, what's the fastest and cheapest way to get to London from here? So I live in the Midlands. The fastest way for me to get to London would be in my helicopter. But that certainly wouldn't be the cheapest, would it? Probably the cheapest would be by train. So a double barrel question is often unanswerable. And we also need to avoid double negatives. So, for example, would you agree that Kim Kardashian is not unattractive? Obviously, a simple question would be, would you agree that Kim Kardashian is attractive? So it's about being careful about the questions that we ask.
Do you think pilot studies are important? So if so, why do you think they are so important?
They're really important. And one of the major things is to highlight any issues with those questions. As we keep saying, the biggest problem with questionnaires and interviews, self-report in general, is writing questions. So we need to trial those questions and we need to act on the feedback we get from the participants we trial it with. What were the problems with the questions? How can we change them? So if we do a pilot study, we can be sure that our questions are at least intelligible and people can actually answer them.
Right. Okay. So tell me more about interviews.
As we mentioned, interviews are face-to-face conversations between the researcher and the participants, and they tend to have open questions. So they tend to generate more qualitative data. So they can be structured, and if it's structured, it's basically really just the interviewer reading out a questionnaire to participants. What is more common, though, is a semi-structured interview. A semi-structured interview, the researcher goes in with a list of some questions, but they can deviate from them if something interesting crops up, something that they hadn't thought about. They can then go down that path and investigate that further, which is really, really useful.
What are the strengths of interviews?
They tend to generate qualitative data, which is in-depth and detailed. So we're getting a reasons of why. We're getting participants to explain their answers to us. And they can also lead to what we call serendipitous findings. And serendipitous means happy accident. So something we hadn't thought of that a participant brings up and we go, oh, gosh, that's really interesting. Tell me more about that. Interviews can have more validity than questionnaires. Although we still have an issue that, participants might succumb to social desirability bias or demand characteristics. But there's the possibility of the interviewer developing a rapport or a relationship with the interviewee, which might mean that they're more honest and open. And of course, the major advantage is that the interviewer can actually explain the questions. The interviewee can say, I don't know what you mean by that. What do you mean by the average week? Can you clarify that for me? So you're going to get more accurate data in that way.
So they sound good. So, but what are the limitations of interviews?
One big limitation is interviewer bias. The interviewer can affect what the participant or the interviewee says. So, for example, if I was interviewing you and I'm smiling and nodding manically, you're likely to carry on talking. But if I start looking at my phone and yawning, then it looks like I'm boring you and you might shut up. So I could affect what people say or don't say. As we said, we've still got issues as well with validity, demand characteristics, and social desirability. And of course, we've also, because we've got qualitative data, it's much, much more difficult to analyse. It takes a long time to go through an interview transcript and try and analyse it using content analysis and look for patterns and comparisons. Whereas a questionnaire, if we've got closed questions, we've just got 60% said yes, 40% said no. It's much easier to analyse.
Oh, that's really helpful. Thank you very much, Deb.
We would like to thank Deb Gajic for her insights into self-reports in psychology. If you have enjoyed this talk and found it useful, look out for the other talks given by Deb on other research methods.